there is a very specific misunderstanding about what it actually takes to do something meaningful. A misconception that I have observed quietly eroding the potential of incredibly smart people over the last 30 years. And it is the belief that difficulty is a sign that you are on the wrong path, when, in reality, difficulty is the only reliable signal that you are doing something that has not been commoditized yet. When you look at the trajectory of successful organizations or impactful lives, you often see the outcome, the celebration, the finished product that looks inevitable in hindsight. But what you are completely missing is the decade of ambiguity where absolutely nothing was guaranteed, and where the feedback loop was entirely silent. I often tell people that I wish upon them ample doses of pain and suffering, not because I am cruel, but because resilience is not an intellectual concept you can learn from a book or a lecture. It is a character trait that is only forged through the direct experience of staying with a problem long after the excitement has faded and the initial adrenaline has worn off. Most people possess the intelligence to solve hard problems. That is rarely the bottleneck in the modern world, but they lack the emotional stamina to endure the phase where the solution is not visible, and so they abandon the project exactly when the real work begins. You have to understand that the world is designed to offer you off-ramps, constantly presenting you with easier alternatives, softer landings, and quicker wins that satisfy the ego but erode your capacity for long-term impact. And if you cannot distinguish between the pain of growth and the pain of injury, you will always retreat to safety. I have noticed a pattern where individuals confuse a lack of immediate progress with failure, but in the realm of solving hard problems, looking like a failure is often a prerequisite to becoming a pioneer, because if the answer were obvious, someone else would have already monetized it. The market, society, and physics itself reward endurance more than they reward raw speed, because speed effectively matters only when the path is clear, but endurance matters when the map is missing and you are forced to reason from first principles rather than following a template. If you find yourself constantly resetting, constantly looking for a new vehicle, or constantly feeling that the world is unfair because your efforts are not immediately recognized, it is likely not a strategy problem. It is a metabolic problem, where your system cannot metabolize the stress required to bridge the gap between a vision and reality. We are going to look at the specific indicators that suggest your mental endurance is undeveloped, not to judge you, but because recognizing these signs is the only way to stop the cycle of starting and stopping that prevents you from ever reaching the compounding phase of success. This is about the physics of achievement, and physics does not care about your feelings. It only cares about the sustained application of force in a single direction over a long enough time horizon to overcome inertia. You need to understand the fundamental shift that is occurring in the economic and intellectual landscape right now. Because if you are operating with a mindset developed for the world of 20 years ago, you are preparing yourself for a game that no longer exists. For the vast majority of the industrial and information ages, value was created by efficiency, by following a process faster and more accurately than the person next to you. And in that environment, endurance was mostly about tolerance for boredom or repetition. But we have entered a phase where efficiency is becoming commoditized at a rate that is frankly terrifying for anyone who relies on routine, because technology and artificial intelligence have effectively driven the cost of solving known problems down to zero. What this means for you is that the only problems left on the table, the only problems that will pay you a premium in terms of money, status, or fulfillment, are the problems that are inherently messy, ambiguous, and resistant to quick fixes. We are moving from an economy of answers to an economy of questions. And in an economy of questions, the ability to withstand the psychological discomfort of not knowing the answer for a long period of time is the single most valuable asset you can possess. I look around and I see a generation that has been conditioned by algorithmic feeds and instant feedback loops to believe that friction is a system error, something to be swiped away or optimized out of existence. But in the real world of building complex systems or navigating a career, the danger is that we have optimized our lives for comfort and speed to such a degree that we have atrophied the specific muscle required to innovate. When everything is on demand, from your entertainment to your food to your information, you lose the habit of struggle. And when you lose the habit of struggle, You lose the capacity to reason from first principles because you are always looking for a template or a shortcut that someone else created. This matters now more than ever because the easy problems, the ones that fit into a checklist, the ones that can be solved by a quick Google search or a standard operating procedure, are gone, taken by software or outsourced to the lowest bidder. The future belongs to the people who can walk into a situation where there is no path, where the data is contradictory, and where the immediate feedback is negative, and say, I will figure this out, not in an hour, but over the course of months or years. If you look at the companies or the individuals who are actually moving the needle today, they are not the ones who found a clever hack. They are the ones who identified a structural problem that everyone else was ignoring because it was too painful to look at, and they just sat with that pain until they understood the physics of the situation. The world is bifurcating into two distinct groups, those who consume complexity and those who are consumed by it. If you fall into the category of people who need immediate validation to keep going, you are essentially fragile, and fragile systems break under volatility. We are entering a decade of extreme volatility, where career paths will not be linear, where industries will dissolve and reform overnight, and where the skills you learned in university might be obsolete before you finish paying off the student loan. In this specific environment, your technical skills are secondary to your psychological constitution. I see so many brilliant engineers, designers, and entrepreneurs who hit a wall not because they lack talent, but because they hit a valley of despair in their projects, and they interpret that feeling as a signal to stop, when in fact that feeling is the signal that the real work has finally started. The old world taught you to avoid failure. The new reality demands that you metabolize failure as information. If you cannot endure the silence of a problem that isn't yielding, you will constantly pivot to easier problems. And by definition, easier problems have lower returns because everyone else is solving them too. You have to zoom out and look at the trajectory of human utility. We used to be valuable because of our muscles, then because of our ability to process data, and now we are valuable because of our ability to synthesize new realities out of uncertainty. This is not a soft skill. This is a survival mechanism. The educational system and the corporate ladder were designed to reduce variance, to keep you in a lane where the inputs and outputs were predictable. But that lane is leading off a cliff. The most dangerous thing you can do right now is to seek comfort in a world that is rewarding adaptation. The cost of this mental fragility is not just a stalled career, it is a life of almost launching that business, almost mastering that skill, almost becoming the person you know you could be. If only you hadn't pulled back when the pressure mounted. You are competing against a global talent pool and non-human intelligence that does not get tired, does not get bored, and does not have an ego to bruise. So if your competitive advantage isn't your ability to suffer through the hard parts of creation, you don't really have a competitive advantage. This is the context you are operating in, a high-stakes, high-ambiguity environment where the ability to delay gratification is no longer a moral virtue, but a strategic necessity. We need to strip away the illusion that success should feel good while it's happening. Usually, it feels like confusion and doubt, and if you aren't prepared for that, you will fold. I want to walk you through the 5 specific indicators that I look for when I am trying to determine if someone has the constitution to go the distance. Because in my experience, talent is abundant, but endurance is rare. And the first sign that you lack this mental endurance is that you optimize for the happy path. In engineering, the happy path is a scenario where everything goes right, where the user clicks the right button, the network is fast, and the database is responsive. But anyone who has built a complex system knows that the happy path accounts for maybe 10% of the code, while 90% of the work is handling the errors, the exceptions, and the failures. If you approach your life or your projects expecting the happy path, you are structurally setting yourself up for a collapse because the moment reality deviates from your optimistic projection, you treat it as a disaster rather than a requirement. I see people start a business or learn a skill, and the moment they hit the first regulatory hurdle or the first syntax error that they can't debug in 5 minutes, they experience a disproportionate emotional crash. This tells me that they view obstacles as an unfair interruption to their success rather than the raw material of their work. The long-term consequence of this is that you become a fair-weather founder of your own life, capable of operating only when conditions are perfect, which means you are useless in a crisis. The second sign is that your energy source is external rather than internal, meaning you function like a battery that needs constant recharging from compliments, likes, views, or encouragement, rather than operating like a nuclear reactor that generates its own fuel. When I look at people who drop out of the race, it is almost always because the external feedback loop went silent. They posted the work and nobody clapped. They wrote the code and nobody used it. If your capacity to work is tied to the immediate applause of the market, you will die in the valley of silence that exists between starting and succeeding. I have seen brilliant individuals abandon projects that would have been worth millions or change their entire career trajectory simply because they could not endure 6 months of working in the dark without someone telling them they were doing a good job. You have to run the math on this. If you spend 10 years jumping from project to project, seeking that initial dopamine hit of validation, you end up with 10 years of beginner level experience in 10 different things, which creates zero compounding value. Contrast that with the person who ignores the silence, stays on one path, and compounds their skill. After 10 years, they are not just 10 times better, they are 1,000 times more valuable because returns at the expert level are exponential, not linear. The third sign is that you mistake boredom for stagnation. There is a deeply dangerous misconception that high-performance work is always exciting, fueled by passion and adrenaline, but the reality is that the actual day-to-day work of solving hard problems is often incredibly mundane, repetitive, and boring. If you cannot tolerate boredom, you will constantly sabotage your own progress by seeking novelty. I see this in young engineers and leaders who want to re-architect the entire system every 6 months, not because it needs it, but because they are bored with maintaining the old one. The people who win are the ones who can stare at the same problem for 2 years, iterating on the minutiae that everyone else finds tedious, because that is where the breakthrough actually hides. If you are constantly pivoting, you are paying a restart tax every single time, destroying the momentum you built. Let's look at the opportunity cost. If you switch directions every 2 years, you never reach the deep expertise layer that typically unlocks after year 5 or year 7. You are trading your future mastery for present-day entertainment. The fourth sign is that you personalize technical failure. When the system breaks, or the deal falls through, or the algorithm changes, you internalize this as a reflection of your worth rather than a property of the system you are navigating. You say, "I am a failure," instead of "this approach failed." This distinction sounds subtle, but it is architectural. If you personalize failure, you will naturally try to avoid it to protect your ego, which means you will stop taking the risks required to solve hard problems. You have to develop a scientist detachment. When an experiment fails, the scientist doesn't cry. They record the data because knowing what doesn't work is valuable intellectual property. I have noticed that the people who sustain high performance over decades treat catastrophes as data points. They don't ask, "Why me?" They ask, "What is the mechanism that caused this?" The fifth and perhaps most critical sign is that you lack a multi-scale time horizon. You operate with a focal length that is too short, judging the success of a 10-year mission by the results of a 10-day sprint. This myopia causes you to panic during normal market fluctuations or periods of slow growth. You see this in investing, where people sell at the bottom because they can't handle the volatility, but you also see it in careers. You quit the job or the learning path because you didn't get the promotion in 6 months, failing to see that the skills you were acquiring would have positioned you for a C-suite role in 5 years. If you cannot hold two time frames in your head simultaneously, the urgency of today and the patience of the decade, you will always make short-term optimization decisions that cannibalize your long-term potential. It is a simple calculation of area under the curve. A small amount of progress sustained over 20 years is geometrically larger than a massive burst of effort that burns out in 20 months. When you ignore these signs, you are not just risking a failed project, you are risking a life of mediocrity, where you are perpetually busy but never effective, constantly starting but never finishing, and always wondering why people with half your intelligence are surpassing you simply because they refuse to let go of the problem. Now we have to have a very uncomfortable conversation about the price of admission. because I see a lot of people who want the output of solving hard problems, the autonomy, the wealth, the respect, but they are ideologically opposed to the input required to get there. And that disconnect is where dreams go to die. There is a pervasive narrative in modern culture that suggests if you are smart enough, or if you have the right tools, or if you find the right hack, you can bypass the suffering. But I am here to tell you that suffering is not a bug in the system, it is the primary feature that gives your achievement value. If you could automate the struggle, if you could bypass the late nights and the crushing doubt and the failures, then the result will be commoditized instantly, because the barrier to entry would be zero. You have to understand that the market pays you for doing the things that other people are unwilling to do, not just what they are unable to do. There are plenty of people with high IQs who are essentially useless in a crisis because they view their intelligence as a tool to avoid pain rather than a tool to endure it. They use their logic to rationalize quitting, creating convincing arguments for why the project isn't worth it, why the timing is wrong, or why the system is unfair, but all they are really doing is intellectualizing their lack of stamina. The reality is that working smart is not a replacement for working hard. It is a multiplier on top of it. And if your base integer of effort is low, multiplying it by a high efficiency score still results in a mediocre outcome. We have to dismantle the myth of balance when it comes to outliers. You cannot have a balanced life and an exceptional life simultaneously, at least not during the building phase, because exceptional results require an obsession that looks like pathology to the average person. I have never met a founder or a high-level operator who changed their industry by working 9 to 5 and prioritizing comfort. I have only met people who were consumed by a problem to the point where they couldn't sleep until it was solved. This is the trade-off that nobody wants to talk about because it sounds unhealthy, and perhaps it is, but it is the physics of greatness. You are competing against entropy, and entropy is relentless. The moment you stop pushing, the system decays. The depth of this reality check is realizing that your feelings are mostly irrelevant to the outcome. The code does not care if you are tired. The market does not care if you are burned out. The problem you're trying to solve does not care about your mental health day. This sounds cold, but it is actually liberating because once you realize that the universe is indifferent to your comfort, you stop expecting it to be easy and you start preparing for the friction. The most dangerous trap I see is the conditional commitment, where you say, I will work on this as long as I see progress. But real endurance is unconditional. It is the ability to work on the architecture of a solution when you have seen zero progress for 3 months. That is the valley of death. Most people turn back at the valley of death because their logical brain tells them it's a waste of time. But the people who cross it are the ones who suspend their need for immediate gratification and operate on faith in their own capacity to figure it out eventually. You also have to accept that you will be misunderstood. When you are operating with long-term endurance, you will look crazy to people who are operating on short-term cycles. They will ask you why you are still working on that failed project, why you haven't pivoted yet, why you are making it so hard on yourself. If you need their approval, you will quit. You have to be willing to look like a fool for a long time to look like a genius in the end. The cost of this mindset is that you can't relate to the complaints of the majority. When people complain about their boss or their commute or their lack of free time, you will find it increasingly difficult to empathize because you know that they are choosing their constraints, just as you have chosen yours. The difference is that their constraints are imposed by a system they occupy, while your constraints are imposed by the mission you are building. This path is lonely. It is mostly sitting in a room, staring at a wall or a screen, wrestling with your own cognitive limitations, feeling stupid, and doing it anyway. If you are looking for a lifestyle, go be an influencer. If you are looking to solve hard problems, prepare to be humbled every single day. The technology of the future, AI, robotics, quantum computing, will strip away every job that requires only competence. The only thing left will be the jobs that require endurance, the ability to suffer through the complexity that the machines can't yet parse. If you are optimizing for a life of ease, you are optimizing yourself out of the economy. The reality is that your capacity to endure pain is the only true proxy for your potential future value. The conclusion I want to leave you with is not a strategy for doing more work, but a fundamental perspective shift regarding your place in the future economy, because the era of being rewarded for participation is over and the era of being rewarded for resilience has begun. When I look at the trajectory of computing and intelligence, I see a clear convergence where the barriers to entry for almost every technical skill are collapsing, which means that simply knowing how to do something. In a world where an AI can write code, generate designs, and synthesize vast amounts of data in seconds, the only remaining competitive advantage for a human being is the ability to sustain focus on a singular, intractable problem for a duration that an algorithm cannot replicate. Because algorithms optimize for the path of least resistance, while humans have the unique capacity to choose the path of greatest resistance for a higher purpose. You need to understand that the difficulty you are feeling right now, the confusion and the urge to quit, is actually the moat you have been looking for. If it were easy, the market would have already arbitraged away the profit. But because it is hard, because it requires this metabolic cost of suffering and uncertainty, most people will turn back, leaving the territory wide open for the few who can endure. This brings us to the ultimate choice you have to make, and it is a binary choice from which you cannot hide. You can choose the path of the consumer, where you outsource your thinking and your struggle to machines and systems, living a life of frictionless comfort that is ultimately fragile and dependent on external forces. Or you can choose the path of the solver, where you deliberately step into the friction, where you view the headache of a complex problem not as a nuisance, but as a signal that you are operating at the frontier of your potential. This choice determines your identity. If you choose comfort, you are choosing to be a spectator in the most transformative period of human history. If you choose endurance, I want you to reconsider the moments when you feel stuck. Do not view them as a sign that you are not smart enough. View them as the moment the real training begins, the gym where your character is being torn down so it can be rebuilt stronger. The people who will lead the next decade are not the ones with the highest credentials or the fastest answers. They are the ones who can hold a question in their mind for years without needing to resolve the tension prematurely. It is a quiet, unglamorous power, but it is the only power that compounds. When you stop looking for the exit, when you stop looking for the hack, and when you simply accept that the work is supposed to be hard, a strange thing happens. The anxiety disappears. You stop fighting the reality of the difficulty and you start dancing with it. You realize that the hard is not something to get through, it is the destination itself. The life you want, the impact you want to have, and the wealth you want to build are all hiding behind the problems you are currently avoiding. So the next time you feel that impulse to quit, that heavy weight of mental fatigue, recognize it for what it is the gatekeeper. Most people will knock on the gate and walk away when it doesn't open. You have to be the one who sets up camp outside the gate and refuses to leave until you have figured out the lock. That is the difference between a hobbyist and a professional, between a dreamer and a founder. The future belongs to the enduring.